We're here on Daf Hey Amud Aleph, and we're completing a sugya that we began yesterday, but the main balance, the subject of today's shir is the new parak, the new Mishnah. Masechet Shekalim is divided up into smaller prakim. So we're up to Rabbi Ovin Omar. And this you'll see if you, again, depending upon what Gemara you have, if you're counting down from the top of Daf Hey Amud Aleph, approximately 9 lines down. First word in the line is Habehema. Rabbi Ovin Omar. Now, Rabbi Ovin is commenting on the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that if you have Achim, two brothers that inherited Behemos, they inherited animals from their father, and then they became Shutfim, so that it depends. If they haven't yet divided up the Yerusha, then we don't see them as Shutfim. And that means that all the animals are considered owned by, again in quotation marks, the father. And therefore, Yechayev Maser. But on the other hand, since the father is Kaviyachol paying the Machzis HaShekel, you put it from Kalbon. And now, Rabbi Ovin quotes Rabbi Shammai, boy. And Rabbi Shammai questions this ptur mina kalbam. And he asks, Mipnei shasiyosam ke'odom echretz maser behema, is therefore to potron mina kalbon? Rabbi Shimi came to the conclusion that what the Mishnah is telling us is that A causes B. It's not just that there are two roads here, two channels, but that one is a cause for the other. And since the Achim are poter mimaiser behema, I'm sorry, this is before the Chalukah. Since the Achim are chayav in maiser behema, therefore they're poter min a kalbon. Now, why are they chayiv in maiser behema? We said that the chumrah is based on the fact that we consider it as if there's one person here, not shutfim, not partners, right? The Torah says the partners are exempt from maser behema, but there are no partners over here. And therefore, if there are no partners over here, all the animals are owned by one entity before the Chalukah, and therefore there's a chiyuv maser behema. As a result, there's a ptur of kalbon. So again, it's very interesting, and I could accept that you're machmir in maser behema to say the chayv in maser behema, but therefore, ask Rav Shammai, you should be potter from kalbon, at a pocho in a kalbon. Now, why should you be potter from a kalbon? Who's chayv in the kalbon? Ultimately, the Yerusha will be divided up, and the monies, the currencies that are in the estate will now be inherited by the various heirs, and each one, insofar as he has a machzah shekel to contribute, is obligated in the midst of machzah shekel, which takes which drags along with it a chiyuv kalbon. Why should you be mekil in kalbon because of the chumrah in meiser behema? On the contrary, if there's a chumrah in meiser behema, then you should be machmir in kalbon. And the logic that compels Rav Shammai to say that you chayav in kalbon is because, look, let's call a spade a spade. Ultimately, this Yerusha is going to be divided up, and each brother, each heir is going to be individually obligated in the mitzvah of machzah shekel. Let each one of them pay a kalbon. So you're going to tell me, well, you're chayav in maser. And why you chayav in maser? Because we don't view the brothers as separate entities and as shutfim, but rather we collapse or we integrate the entire estate into one ownership. It's one cheftz of mammon and one single bailus of tfusas habayis. There's no shutfis, and that makes a logical sense why you should be chayiv ma'aser behema. There's no shutfim here. The ptur of shutfim is completely gone. But that's not a reason to say that there should be a ptur of kalbon. It doesn't make sense that because you're mechayev him in maser, therefore ipso facto you should be potter in kalbon. There are two people here, Reuven and Shimon, inheriting their father Yaakov, and each one is chayev in Masechet Shekel, and Masechet Shekel carries with it a chiyuv kalbon. Let each one pay a kalbon. Amrulei. I guess the Bnei Yeshiva responded to Rabbi Shammai. Lo shanya he? Don't you realize the difference here? In the case of Yerusha, since they haven't yet gotten to the stage of Chalukah, so we have here a Tfusas Habayis, and if there's a Tfusas Habayis, this is not Shutfus. And therefore, we understand that the father is holding on to the Tfusas Habayis. There's no split in Shutfus. No, if there's no split in Shutfus, and we don't see Reuven as if he inherited his portion and Shimon his, because we haven't yet gotten to the point of Chalukah, then who knows in Sela Achas Shlema. What the father is going to do, again, the father is gone, but I mean, the payment, the collection of the shekel is going to be one seller, which is 2 machzis hashekels, on behalf of both Reuven and Shimon. But who's paying this? It's coming from a common pot, so to speak. It's coming from a communal bank, which is called the Tfusas Habayis. And therefore, it's as if the father is giving the Masechet Shekel on behalf of Reuven and Shimon. There's no chiyuv on Reuven and Shimon right now on the chefts of the nechasim. You know what I mean? There's no Masechet Shekel in the hands of Reuven and one in the hands of Shimon. And now we're going to demand a payment of a tax on each Masechet Shekel, add a kalbon name. That's not what's going on over here. Reuven doesn't have his Masechet Shekel. Shimon doesn't have his. And the entire Mammon is now in the hands of the Tfusas Habayis, of the father, so to speak, representing the bias. Now he's paying a Masechet Shekel on behalf of both Reuven and Shimon, so he comes to the Gizbar. Again, I don't mean it literally, obviously. And the Gizbar is collecting now a Selah. If the Selah is being given on behalf of Reuven and Shimon to exempt them from the Masechet Shekel, then no Talmud should be collected. And the Gemara is not happy with that answer. Me'ata, says the Gemara, if you're telling me that because there's a din of Tfusas Habayis, is then afilu cholku v'chazu v'nishtatfu chayovim b'masa behemo p'tur min ha'kalbon? According to your logic, what should happen is that even after the chazara of Chalukah, meaning chazar, meaning the second stage in which they divvy up the nechasim, chazu, now there's a chazar to stage number 3, and they become shutfim. So that now we should say that since before the Chalukah they were potem in a kalbon, is therefore even now after the Chalukah they should be potem in a kalbon. And the logic of the Gemara is that now when they reestablish their shutfis, they turn the clock back, so to speak, to the original stage of Tfusas Habayis. In a sense, stage 3, going backwards retroactively, skips over stage 2 of Chalukah and goes back to stage 1, which is Tfusas Habayis. And the shutfis that they now reestablish is nothing more than a reflection of the original Tfusas Habayis. They want to go back to the state of Tfusas Habayis. And if that be the case, then they should be potem in a kalbon. Utaninon, and yet the Mishnah says, chayovim b'kalbon, upturim maser behema. And after Chalukah and chazu v'nishtatfu, the halacha is that they're potem maser sheni, maser behema, and they're chayiv in kalbon. I don't understand. Why shouldn't the original state, which generates 2 dinim, number 1, that state of Tfus Habayis generates a chiyuv ma'aser behema. And number two, that state of Tfus Habayis patters them up from Kalmon through the shutfis, v'chazru v'nishtatfu, we should go back to the original state, and the din should be identical to what it was when it was in the state of Tfus Habayis. And what does the Gemara answer? Nothing. There's no answer in the Gemara to this question. Comes along, Rebbe Eliyahu Fulda lived about 4.5 centuries ago, and he writes that hachiluku pashut, the distinction is so simple. Machmas pshituso lo chosh l'tarza. Don't think that the Gemara was in a state of silence because shtika kodadnami. On the contrary, the Gemara didn't even bother rejecting the logic because the distinction is so clear. Chetfisas habayis harehu keilu aviem. It's like the father is actually giving the maaser, and therefore he's chayav v'maaser because it's before chalukah. Ve'ilu hu mevi shkolim. If at that stage he would bring the shkolim on behalf of both Reuven and Shimon b'shvilam, potem mikalba. Why? Because when someone gives Masechet Shekalim on behalf of someone else, that gratis and magnanimous gift is not going to be penalized and feed with the you added the tax of the kalba. Masha'enkein b'cholku v'nishtatfu shuv ein lanechosim shaychus la'ava. Once they do the chalukah, each one is inheriting his portion. The father is out of the picture. And now they decide to join together in a shutfis. Hare he shutfis muchudeshes. It's a brand new shutfis. So whereas the Gemara in the name of Rav Shammai thought that now the shutfis could jump backwards and resurrect out of the dead, literally, the father, and make it into a Tfus Habayis and reestablish the original Tfus Habayis. Says Rav Eliyahu Fulda, that's obviously not correct. That Tfus Habayis in which the father was paying for the Maser and paying for the Shkolim, that's gone. That's history. That would have been the situation at one point in time. But now they did the Chalukah, the father's out of the picture. Now they created Shutfis, a brand new Shutfis. And Shutfim are potem in Masechet Behema. Shutfim are chayav in Kalba. I'm tempted. Now let me, on the one hand, express my intuition, but at the same time, my hesitation. Like, the Gemara says, "Who mosid lo, who mafarik." I suspect that the Machshon Rav Shammai had a concept called a chefza shel mama. I hesitate because I understand, and we've seen all over Shas, a chefza shel mitzvah has certain dinim, and even after you fulfill the mitzvah, you complete the mitzvah, still it has dinim that were chal in the chefza that do not dissipate. You have a chefza shel hegdesh, and even if Sulei HaMukdashim, there's still some residue of the original status of chefza shel hegdesh. We have a chefza shel isur in the case of nidarim, in the case of macholas hasuros, and there are dinim that are chal in the chefza, they become inherent in the chefza. For example, the Gemara says in Nidarim Chavtes, a very famous sugya, Kiddusha lo paka bichdi. You can't just say, I'm being magdish something for 30 days. And after 30 days, without any pidyon, the hegdish is gone, it dissipates. No. Once I was magdish something, it changes the chefza, because hegdish is an inherent change in the chefza, as is macholas asuras, chefza shel mitzvah, and so forth. I hesitate to raise the possibility that there's something called a chefza shel mama, that dinim of a financial nature are generated in the object and become an inherent part of the essence of the object, such that legally things continue even if the original makna, the cause of the kinyan is gone. So the Makshan Rav Shammai may have held that there's such a thing called a Chefta Shel Mamon, in which there are dinim that are generated inherent in the Mamon and they don't change. They what's the word I want to use? They continue to exist. It's like you can have a virus that's dormant. There's a certain dormant element to that Chefta Shel Mamon and those dinim that were generated. For example, you have a Tfusas Habayis, and the law is that there's a Chiyuv Maser on that Mamon, on those behemos. You have 10 behemos, and there's a Ptur of Kalba. Why? Because as long as the money, in the case of currency, the Masechet Shekel is in the hands of the Tfusas Habayis, then the law is there's a Ptur of Kalbon. So the Gemara thinks, Rav Shammai thinks, that even though the original Dorem, that power which generated the status of the moment, is gone with the Chalukah, they now divided up. The Tfusas Habayis is history, but those dinim are chal in the Chefta. And what that means is that if they go back to a state of shutfis, then the Chiyuv Masa remains in place. It was dormant, and now it comes to fruition. And the Ptur Kalbon was dormant, and now expresses itself after they reestablish through shutfis. Now, again, this is the intuitive sense that I would take in trying to analyze what Rav Shammai was thinking and why the Gemara might have rejected it. But honestly, Torah requires honesty. And honestly, I'm not happy with this, because at the moment of Chalukah, if let's say you would freeze that frame of Chalukah, that moment, and now the Gizbar comes to Ruvain and to Shimon, and he demands the Masechet Shekel, there's no question each one would have to add a kalb. And furthermore, at that moment of Chalukah, when Ruvain now counts up his animals, and lo and he has 10 in the flock, and Shimon the same, he'll be a chiyuv of maaser. What are you going to tell me? That there's a ptur of maaser that was chal as a result of the Tfusas Habayis. So it's a very interesting concept. That Tfusas Habayis, on the one hand, has the potential to generate dinim in the mamon, in the cheft itself, but right now it's only in a potential state. It's not really dinim that are chal. When there'll be a shutfis later on, that will wake up and activate the Tfusas Habayis with all its dinim in the moment. Very complicated. Okay, let's go on. Rabbi Ba b'shem Abba bar Rav Huna, he shnei achim sheyarshu es aviem, he shnei gisim sheyarshu es chamir. So he means an equation. He's going to make an analogy between the case of two brothers that inherited their father, and they didn't make a chalukah. So as long as there was no chalukah, as we said before, there's a chiyuv masa behema and a ptur kalbon. And the same din, by analogy, applies to two brothers-in-law who are married to the two sisters of, let's call it, the two daughters of Yaakov. And now their father-in-law, their common father-in-law, dies. There are no sons to inherit the father-in-law, so the inheritance therefore goes to the daughters. That's called what in the biblical language? Benos Slavchad, right? And now the Yerusha of the daughters now transfers over to, respectively, to each one's husband. These are called the Gisim, the brothers-in-law, even in modern Hebrew. And the din will be the same, says Rabbi Ba. if they haven't yet done a chalukah, they will be chayav in ma'aser behema, and the reason for that is because it's tfus habayis, it belongs to Yaakov, and they put them in a kalbon because Yaakov in effect is paying for his two sons-in-law, respectively, a Masechet Shekalim. And now the question is, what exactly is the chiddush of Rabbi Ba? So here he quotes the Rash Surleah, and he says the following: Hayinu yecholim lomar. In other words, if not for Rabbi Ba, the Salkedai Tchamina, Shedafka Bibanim Nigrorim Achra VM Vayerusha Lo Yotza Mishus L'Shus, and that's called Tfus Habayis. And there's a special relationship between Banim and Aviyim. That's called Greira. Greira meaning that they are one and the same, both brothers, Reuben and Shimon, with Yaakov the father. And therefore they're part of Makalbon because in effect, Yaakov is shelling out on their behalf. Is lo yotza mirshus aviem l'shusam, and hence they're part of Makalbon, and for the same reason, l'chayv mas. Aval Yerushas gisim lechameim, but in the case of two brother-in-laws that are inheriting their father-in-law, sheba lidei chasanim mikoach ishus l'neshayim, they don't have any claim to the father's Yerusha. It's the ishus that gives them rights of Yerusha. Havamina, I would have said, kilakuchos heim upturim mimaiser behema v'chayovim b'kalb. Wow. I have to tell you, this is very profound lumdus here. And the Rash Soleo is coming to explain just a Havamin in the Gemara, but it's so deep here. He's saying that there's something called Yerusha. And then there's another din of Yerusha, which operates through the mechanism of Ishus. It's not a direct Yerusha. You cannot say that the father is holding on to the Yerusha Fusas Habayis on behalf of the two Gisim, because the Gisim in and of themselves have no right, no status of Yorship. They gain that status through Ishus, through getting married to the two daughters. So there's no direct, it's an indirect relationship. It's like Shibuda de Rab Nassan, if you know what I mean. Or it's like Mishmash Nachla. The Nachla really goes through the daughters who are the real direct heirs, but they don't have rights to collect because they're already married off. So within the framework of marriage, that Tzchus Yerusha is now transferred over to their husbands. How do we view this? One way of viewing it is that the husbands, through Yerusha, pick up the Tzchus of the daughters, and since there are no sons, to inherit the father-in-law directly, and therefore becomes Tzchus Habayis. The father-in-law is actually holding on to the Yerusha, which he's going to transfer to his two sons-in-law, just like he would transfer to his two daughters. He cannot transfer to his two daughters because they're married already, and they lost their yad, so to speak, within the framework of Nisuin, and their yad, Lizkos B'Yerusha, was now transferred over to their husbands, respectively. So before Rabbah, we would have said that any rights to Yerusha that are reflected in the two Gisim are new rights that are generated by Ishus. And the Tfusas Habayis is gone. Kamashmal and Rabbi Bar says, no. These two brothers-in-law, through, in other words, now Nisu in marriage Ishus becomes only a means to an end. It only becomes a secondary, shall we say, technical, what's the word I want to use? oof, it's an intermediary step. And what it does is it facilitates a tfusas habayis directly between the father and the two sons-in-law. So for those who love, for those here who love their father-in-law, I mean, I'm still saying Kaddish for my father-in-law, it's good news, because the final maskana is that the son-in-law is part of the Yerush of his father in a direct sense, and those dinim of number one chiyuv meiser behema, number two the tour of the what's called the kalbonim, I gotta get kalbonim, those dinim still apply. And finally, the Gemara now quotes Machlokas Tanoim. What exactly do we do with these kalbonos? Where does the kalbon go? And for what purpose is the money being collected, this extra fee? Is it part of the Masechet Shekel, and it goes exactly where the Masechet Shekel goes, or is it a separate chiyuv b'fnei atzma? Lehechan or liechan hayu hakablanos nofli. So the Brisa says the following: Rabbi Meir Omer l'shkolit. I mean, it's almost Rabbi Meir l'shitaso. You feel intuitively that since Rabbi Meir holds that this halach of kalbon is d'oraisa, and even if you come forward with a Masechet Shekel exact change, as we called it, you still have to add the kalbon. The kalbon is just simply an extension of the Masechet Shekel. Lamad Davar Dome. It's like a chomesh in Tashlumei Truma. Zar eats Truma, and now he has to add a 20% fee to the original value of the grains that were Truma. And what's the din of the chomesh? The chomesh itself becomes Truma. So now the Tashlumei Truma include not just the keren, but also the chomesh. Here too, says Rabbi Meir, this is my own analogy, that in the case of Masechet Shekel, the kalbon is an additional payment, and it becomes part of the Masechet Shekel. So just like the Masechet Shekel is earmarked for the Trumas Alishka to buy Karbonos Tzibur, that's what's going to happen with the kalbon as well. And let's add the Matbea Shel Eish. Kazei Yitnu, that was Rabbi Meir's Shita, as to why the chiyuv of kalbon is d'oraisa, because Kazei Yitnu. And we don't have the Matbea Shel Eish that was extant at the time Moshe Rabbeinu. We have to make up the discrepancy between our Masechet Shekel today and the original Masechet Shekel Matbea Shel Eish, Kazei Yitnu. So we add the kalbon. The kalbon is obviously a part and parcel of the payment of the Masechet Shekel. And therefore, Kodem Mehem, what do we do with the kalbon? We buy Karbonos Tzibur. Rabbi Lazar Omer, Linid. Now, let's just say a few words about a concept in Kodshim, which is called Kates HaMizbeach. Let's say a person offers to the Migdash or to the Mizbeach a sum of money. And there's Mosros, there are extra funds that were not needed. So let's say, for example, he offers X amount of money for a carbon ola. And at the end of the day, they buy a carbon ola with less funds. So that extra money goes into a pot, which is called Kates HaMizbeach. What do they do with that Kates HaMizbeach? It's a very fascinating concept. I'm sure it has philosophical implications too. We don't want the Mizbeach to be idle. That's called Shelo Yeh Mizbeach Bata, or Man Hebrew Panui, so that there are certain times where, for whatever reason, there was no flow of voluntary karbanos, And the Mizbeach, they brought whatever they had to bring, the Tom Shel Shachar, the Tom Shel Ben Arbayim, and there was a whole section, a segment of time, and the Mizbeach was sitting idly. We have to lasiko, like a child. You have to make sure the child is always busy, because if the child is not busy, who knows what the child is going to do to your house. For grandparents, that's a very important message. Keep the child busy. No, you've married off all your children. You don't have any toys around. Make sure you have an ample supply of toys when the grandchildren come to visit you. You know what I mean, right? So you also have to keep the Mizbeach busy. And whenever the Mizbeach was free and idle, they would go into this kupa, into this shofar, which had in it Kates HaMizbeach, and they would purchase Karbanos Nidava and bring it on the Mizbeach as an extra Nidava to HaKadosh Baruch. And that's what we're going to do, according to Rabbi Lazar, with these funds that are called kalbonim. In a sense, Rabbi Lazar is emphasizing the fact that the kalbon is not a doraisa. It's not integral to the chiyuv of Masechet Shekalim. It's a separate payment that was imposed midrabanan as a rabbinic innovation on the Masechet Shekalim in order so that the Hegdei should have ample funds and they shouldn't be at a loss of funds. So if it's for the sake of the Hegdei to have ample funds, then we know where it should be earmarked and place it into the Kates HaMizbeach. Now, I'll both say, up until this point, I have a grasp on what's going on. From here on, all the way to the end of the Perek, which is only 2 lines later, but I don't know what's going on. Rabbi Shimon Shizuri Omer, what do we do with the Kalbonim? Is Rikua Zahav Vitzipui Lebeis Kodesh HaKadosh. Now, for this, we have to learn sugyas that we haven't gotten to, which I'm very unfamiliar with. For example, if you would fast forward to the 4th chapter, which is called Hatruma, you'll see the first Mishnah is on Daf Tesam and Beis. Okay, and that sugya will continue until Yudam and Beis. And on Daf Yudam and Beis, you will see a statement about Mosar Hatruma. So if you're looking on Yudam and Beis and the Mishnah on the top of the Amud, and you count down about 15 lines, or it's a little bit less maybe, is something called Mosar Hatruma. And the Mishnah says, so again, Truma is referring to the Trumas Halishka. So if you remember, we said that on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, they began the purchase of Karbanos Hatzibur from the new Shekalim of this year. And they ended up with a surplus of currency in the Trumas Halishka after buying all the Karbanos Hatzibur. So that's called Mosar Hatruma. Mos shenisharu bekupos aktanos b'sof hashana melyu osimba. So the Mishnah says rikue zahav and tzipui lebeis kodesh hakadosh. Now, the Kodesh HaKadoshim had a very unique floor and walls in that they were made of gold. And Rikuim are flat pieces of gold. They hammered out the gold and they made it into like tiles almost, flat. In Hebrew, it's called tasim. Singular is tas, like a platter of gold. And those are called rikuei zav. They were made of gold. And what they did was they covered the floor of the Kodesh Kodashim with these rikuei zav, and also the walls of the Kodesh Kodashim. So that's what, if keeping the Mishnah open in front of us for a moment, going back now to Rabbi Shimon Shizuri in the Brisa here at the end of the first parak, he says that what we do with the extra mammon, which is not the extra Masechet Shekel after they bought it, but with the kalbonos, is that they use it the same way they would use Mosar Hatruma to create Rikuei Zav for the Kodesh Kodashim. So I'm lost here, but all I can tell you is the following. None of the Mefarshim help me here. I think what's going on is that this sheet of Reb Shimon Shizuri is midway between Rabbi Meir and Reb Lazar. What do I mean midway? On the one hand, Reb Shimon Shizuri, like Rabbi Meir, subsumes or classifies the Kalbonim as Machzis HaShekel. And in that sense, they really belong to the Trumas HaLishka. But on the other hand, he is almost on the turf of Rabbi Eliezer because he's saying, we're not going to use these monies, these funds to buy Korbanos HaTzibur like Rabbi Meir would have it, but we view them as extra shkolim, as surplus shkolim. So in a sense, Rav Shimon Shizuri sees this as part of the payment of shkolim, but it's independent. It's part of the payment of shkolim insofar as it's truma, no less than the shkolim. It has the same truma. It doesn't go into the Ketz HaMizbeach as Rabbi Elazar would have it. It goes into the Trumas HaLishka, but it's stamped from the get-go as Mosar Truma. What do you mean Mosar Truma? We need this money to buy Korbanos Tzibur. No. You can't use it for Korbanos Tzibur. You got to treat it as Mosar Truma. It's Truma, but a separate branch of Truma, and it is classified from the get-go as Mosar Truma. Now, Rabbosai, what boggles my mind, because again, I'm a total ignoramus here. I'm telling you the truth. If you would have asked me which Kedusha is greater, that of Korbanos Tzibur or that of Rikuei Zav, Litzipui Kodesh Kodashim, I would have told you that the Kodesh Kodashim is the highest level of Kedusha. And now we're saying something counterintuitive, that the Shkolim themselves are designated for Korbanos Tzibur, and the Mosar is going to be used for a higher level of Kedusha. Why would surplus, extra money, be earmarked for a higher level of Kedusha? That's not a kasha on Reb Shimon Shizuri. That's a kasha on the Mishnah in the fourth parak, the second Mishnah in the fourth parak. And again, Rabbi, I'm going to tell you something which is totally counterintuitive. That the Kedusha of Korbanos Tzibur is that much greater than the Tzipui of the Kodesh Kodashim. Why? Because tzipui of Kodesh Kadoshim is hegdesh with an Isur Me'ilah. You're not allowed to use it for your own purposes, but it doesn't have Kedushas HaGuf. It's Mamon Hegdesh. And Mosar of Masechet HaShekel is not money that was earmarked for Kedushas HaGuf when you take a behemoth and you say, this is a carbon ola for the Tamid Shel Shachar, but rather it's Kedushas Damim. It's a Chefetz of Mammon. It's Mammon Hegdesh. But we're going to designate the Mammon Hegdesh for the highest level of Bedek Habayis, which is Tzipui Kodesh HaKadosh. But the plot grows thicker. And it becomes even miserably complicated here. Ben Azai Omer, Shulchanin, Hayunotlinos on Bischara. Ben Azai puts the Kalbon on the lowest level that you could possibly think. It's not part of the Shkolim for Kedushas HaGuf for Karbanas HaTzibur. It's not even Mosar Truma for Kedushas Damim for Tzipui of the Kodesh Kadoshim. And not only that, it's not even Keitz HaMizbeach. It's not even going to be used in an event that the Mizbeach is Batel. Let's use the money to buy the Davos. It's used to pay off the money changes. Truth is, personally, I'm not trying to prejudice you, but I can commensurate, I can identify with Ben Azai. Because what is the Kalbon? The whole purpose of the Kalbon, unless you accept Rabbi Meir, is in order to offset the loss of the payment to the money changes. Let's use this extra fee to pay off the money changes. It makes a lot of sense. Again, if you go with Rabbi Meir, that's one thing. And then you're classifying and defining the Kalbon as part of the Shkolim. Right? It's not that the shekel of Moshe Rabbeinu. Then I understand. Earmark it for Karbanas and Kedushas HaGuf. Perhaps Reb Shimon Shizuri also belongs to that camp and call it Mosar Truma. Rabbi Lazar, on the other hand, is saying, no, this is a rabbinic obligation to add the Kalbon. And if that be the case, it's like an Adava. It's basically, it's like, I'll give you an example. Lemad Doma, Rabbi Lazar is comparing it to, right, Psachim Dav Zayin. The Gemara wants to know what bracha do you make on a Darabanan? And there's one opinion that on a Daraisi you make a bracha with a Lamed, and on a Darabanan you make a bracha with an Al. So that if the Rabbanan say that after you Mavatal Yechametz, you are Chayiv in Biur, so the bracha should be Al Biur Chametz, because it's only a Darabanan. Or if you're reading the Megillah, you make a bracha of Al Mikra Megillah, because it's only Darabanan. So the famous Ravid says, so what if it's only Darabanan? Therefore, you change the Nusach HaBracha from Lamed to an Al, and he says because the Darabanan is like a Rishus, vis-a-vis a Dorais. Dorais is the real bona fide Chiyuv, and the Darabanan is a Rishus. And here also, says Rabbi Eliezer, you know what we're going to do with the Kalbon? It's like, it's a Darabanan. It's a rabbinic invention. If that be the case, it's like a Rishus, it's like a carbon Adama. Bring it as an Adama and give it into the Keitz HaMizbeach. Comes along Ben Azai and he says, wait a minute, you are telling me that this is a rabbinic institution. What motivated the Rabbanon to add an additional fee to your Masechet Shekel Doraisa? The answer is to offset the loss of the money changes. So let's earmark the money for the money change. Yesh omrim lo tzas drachim, which means that the Gizbar wears two hats. One hat is the Mizbeach, is the Kodesh Kadosh. It's Hegdish. The Beis Hamikdash needs funds. We have to bring korbanos, whether korbanos hatzibur, whether they are nidavos, whether or not we have to fix up the Mikdash itself. That's one hat that we wear. But the Gizbar wears a different hat entirely. And he represents the municipality, the city of Yerushalayim. And the city of Yerushalayim needs work. We've got to pave the roads. I don't know why he mentions paving the roads. I would have said, again, if you'll, it's not aesthetically pleasing, but I would have said collecting the rubbish. That's why every Motzei Shabbos I get delayed by a half hour because they're collecting the rubbish. I can't go through the streets of Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai. So I have to time myself, when they're not collecting the rubbish. But in any event, whatever the needs of the city are, we have to tax the people in order to have funds for the city. The chiddush here of Yeshom, and we don't know who they are, is that the kalbon is to be defined as a tax, like any other tax. And we have to tax the people. What do we do with it? We pave the roads. And interesting, Rabbeinu Meshulam, one of the Rishonim, adds chafiras boros. What does he mean by chafiras boros? We're talking about cisterns of water. Back in the day, they didn't have, you couldn't just open the faucet. You had to go out to a public cistern. So you might have had your private backyard source of water, but we needed public water. So Rabbeinu Meshulam is saying that drachim is any public use and responsibility of the municipality for the sake of the public. And the city needs a water system, the city needs roads, and all that money of the kalbon is going to be earmarked for those needs. And Rabbeinu Meshulam adds two words to the Gemara that we don't have in our text. Ulahotzas harabim. In other words, it says drachim, boros, and otzas harabim, which is a general statement, all-inclusive of anything that's necessary for the city on behalf of the rabbin. Then he quotes the Rash Barash, who says, Litzorech b'nias chomos ha'ir umigdaloseh. I don't know, Rabbi, if you ever went to visit the Migdal David. Have you been there? They have a little bit of a museum there. Next time you go, you should have one word in your lips. Kalbon. Where did they get the money for the Migdal of David to build up Migdalos and the Chomos around Yerushalayim? Right, the coastal that we have today. Well, okay, I don't want to get into debates about it, but certainly the wall that you see when you first come up to Yerushalayim, that general, that's for sure Chomos Yerushalayim. Well, not Chomos that date back to the time of the this. And where are the funds for those Chomos Yerushalayim? Again, they may have been built by non-Jewish Turkish this, but if we would have built those Chomos, we would use the money for the kalbon for the Chomos. And this is no doubt for the security of the city. But the Rash Soleo says, Hotzos drachim litzorech masaos kedei sheyagiru ashkolim lehegdish. He doesn't want to use the kalbon for some general need of the city. The kalbon, says the Rash Soleo, has to be earmarked for something related to the shkolim. After all, it's an addendum to the shkolim. So what do? We use it to pave those roads that are necessary to bring the shkolim to the Trumas HaLishka. The only thing I don't understand about the Rash Soleo is if that be the case, why not use the money to pay the Ben Azai? What do you say, to shulchanim, to pay the shulchanim. You want to earmark the funds for something related to the payment of the kalbon as an accessory to the Masechet Shekel. Then Bechora Ben Azai has the upper hand here. It's more logical intuitively to use it to pay off the money changes, because that's what the Gizbar has to do with this massive amount of Masechet Shekel. He's got to change it to larger coins. I find it a little amusing to say Hadron Alecha Perek Bi'echad Bi'adar, because we learned so far 3 blot Gemara. That's a little bit of a cheat, when you can make a L'chaim on 3 blot Gemara. So let's begin now the 4th perek. We only have about 5 minutes left, but just to at least, get a jump start on the 2nd perek. And the Mishnah says, Mitzarfim Shekalim Lidarkonos Mipnei Masui Haderech. The collection of the Masechet Shekel was engineered all over the state of Israel, in many different cities, villages, and communities throughout. And every person, wherever he lived, from Dan to Beersheba, right, in the old days, and he used to contribute his Masechet Shekel. So the Mishnah tells us that those who are in charge of collecting the funds in each city and each location were allowed to take those funds and convert them into darkonos. The darkonos were larger coins, golden coins. And that would make it so much easier to transport the money, because if you have masses of Masechet Shekel coming from Haifa, to Yerushalayim, it's very unwieldy. It's a major undertaking. And they were always afraid of thieves, attackers, who on the way would see, there's a massive trucks, like a circus, one wagon after the other full of money. It was a very dangerous situation. You would put the money of Hegdesh in a very dangerous position. To make it easier and more secure to transport the monies, because if you have masses of small coins, very difficult to transport masses of small coins. It's much easier to transport a smaller number of larger coins. Now, you may remember that we discussed something called the shofros. Now, the shofar was not a shofar, but the shofar was a kli, a receptacle, that was wide on the upper part, and it got smaller on the bottom. So what would happen was you could put many different coins into the shofar. It would fall down into a more narrow part. And in the Beis Hamikdash, there were 13 such shofros that we used for gathering together the monies that were contributed to the Mikdash. And the Mishnah says, "Kishem shayu shofros b'mikdash kach hayu shofros b'medina." In other words, in all the cities of Israel, when they gathered together the shekalim, they placed them into shofros, just like they did in the Beis Hamikdash. And all this is in order to facilitate a protection of the monies of the shekalim, that they should go into the shofros and then end up in a smaller and more narrow place at the end of the bottom of the shofar, and that would protect the most. So just to read a note here from the Rashas, he says that the shofros were baskets or containers, Shemenichim Amos Suras HaShofar was milamala. Oh, I'm sorry. I made a mistake. Suras HaShofars. I made a mistake. I'm sorry. I said that the shofars were wide on top and narrow on the bottom. Get that out of your brain. That was. I get confused. It was just the opposite. It was narrow on top. Why was it narrow on top? So that the Ramoyim, so swindlers and thieves, could not put their hands inside the shofar. The hand would not fit into the shofar. So the Suras HaShofar was Saros Milamala. They were only wide enough to fit the Shekalim, the Masechet Shekel. I don't know the exact size of the Masechet Shekel, but whatever it was. And it was Rechavos Milamata. And this would guarantee that no one could put his hand into the shofar because it was Saros Milamala. B'nei Aramayim shelo yuchlu lahachnis yadam kidei lahotzi mos min hateva. So what we're up to now is B'nei Ha'ir shesholchu et shekleim v'nignavu. This is a massive sugya that we're about to learn. I'll just give you the coming a preview of this. It's a very exciting sugya. The question is, when the Shekalim had to be transported from from Haifa to Shalayim, they hired couriers called shluchim. In my day, we were called runners. I don't know if anybody relates to that word. That's probably a slang word. And the monies got lost. Somewhere between Haifa and Yerushalayim, the monies got lost, or they were stolen. And the shluchim claim that we did our best to protect the shekalim, but circumstances were beyond our control. The Gemara is going to go through various scenarios of onsim, of situations where no one could have protected the loss of the shekalim. And these shluchim are claiming. Now, the issue here is, and we're going to learn a little bit Metzia for this, it's Mamish Dini Mamanas, who is the litigant, who is the plaintiff, who is going to sue the shluchim? Because who is now responsible to guarantee that those coins reach Yerushalayim? Is it the Gizbar? Meaning, as soon as the money came into the hands of the Gizbar, he is now personally responsible, and he appoints the shluchim. And if the monies don't reach Yerushalayim, the Gizbar, is personally responsible. He now has to be toveh the shluchim, and the shluchim will now take a shvuah of Shalom Pasha, Shalom Shalach Bayad, and so forth, so on, all the shvuahs of a showman. Or shall we say no? The Gizbar is only a middleman. He's representing the people who contributed the shekalim. And if the monies don't reach Yerushalayim, then the people will have to replace the shekalim with a second shekel. Each Reuven, Shimon, and Levi will have to bring and offer another matzah shekel because his mitzvah was never fulfilled. And in that case, it's the B'nei Ha'ir who are the litigants. They are the plaintiffs. They sue the shliach, and the shliach owes them a shvuah. And whether or not the shliach owes the shvuah to the gizbar or the shliach owes it to the B'nei Ha'ir is a very fundamental machlokes which has repercussions, and that's what the Mishnah is going to address, and we'll see it in Mitzvah Shem tomorrow. Okay, then, thank you so much, and have a great day.